Listen, listen to the gospel message. Hear the words of eternal life. Listen, listen to the gospel message. Hallelujah. Listen, listen to the gospel message. Hear the words of eternal life. Listen, listen to the gospel message. Hallelujah.
Point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live. So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and passed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years, and she had endured much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. And she had heard about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his cloth. And she said, If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well. Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body, and that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, Who touched my clothes? And his disciples said to him, You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, Who touched me? He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him that the whole truth. He said to her, Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, Do not fear, only believe. He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And he had entered, he said to them, Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside, and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha, come, which means, Little girl, get up. And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. It's the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
What a story. But sorry, I'm not going to preach on this gospel reading today. Instead, I'm going to focus on our second reading, the text from Paul to the Corinthians church. And it's the perfect text for preaching about generous giving. So, talk about generous giving. I remember a story I heard years ago. The story is about 2000 something years ago. It's about Jesus' time, but the main character is not Jesus, but another king whose name is Alexander the Great. He is one of the greatest kings in the human history. The story told that one day the most famous king passing by a street, and all the people around there, they hid their faces in the dirt and didn't dare to even raise their head to see the king. But right on the corner, and there was a beggar, a blind beggar, and he's always there begging for some spare money or food. But that day, when he heard that Alexander the Great is passing by, and he didn't hide his face. Instead, he raised his voice and called out for help. And he said, my Lord, please help me. I'm just a beggar. Please give what you have." And the king gave him a bag of gold coins. And all the people around are amazed. At that moment, one of Alexander's followers whispered to him. He said, "My lord, copper coins would meet the beggar's need. Why give him gold?" Alexander the Great responded, "The copper coins would suit the beggar's need, but gold coins suit the manner of Alexander's giving." At the end, the preacher of the gathering that I heard this story and told us the generous giving is important, but the manner of giving is much more than that. And in the second letters to the Corinthians church, the Paul put it very plainly and directly. Paul asked the Corinthians church to give generously and at the same time giving willingly. But here Paul used a very different approach on the topic of generous giving. In this passage, Paul doesn't see offering as an act of gratitude as we usually see it. Paul doesn't argue that God has done so much things for us, and we ought to show our gratitude by our financial gifts. There is nothing wrong about it. But here, Paul was focusing on God's generosity. There is nothing about secret reward in this life or the life beyond. God gave willingly. So he asked the Corinthians church to give willingly, not thinking about the reward. On the contrary, the verse 6 of the chapter 8, Paul calls the generous giving the act of grace on our part. That is the point. Giving willingly means we are doing the act of grace on our part. We all know this liturgical term, grace. and it's quite a Lutheran term. And we know the justification by faith alone through grace. That is the point of Paul's teaching. Paul believes that generous giving is never inwardly focused. Rather, it shall be outwardly focused always. For Paul, generous giving is all about living a Christ shaped life. That's why Christians' generous giving is an appeal to love, to join God's love. That is why Paul told the Corinthians church, the Macedonian church, they did it extremely well, even when they were themselves suffering the extreme poverty. So I heard another story from the gathering I just mentioned. I heard it has happened about 20 something years ago in China. It was late 1980, 1990s, when China was not as wealthy as it is today. I still remember those days I went to university, and instead of paying the tuition, rather I got some government support because everything is so cheap. My support was about 20 Canadian dollars a month, and it's more than enough to support yourself for food and other needs. So just put that in your consideration. 20 Canadian dollars can cover a young person's monthly needs. The story told that a group of church leaders, lay and clergy from United States, they visited China and got a chance to join some local churches' Sunday worship. An elder Chinese lady from LA area, Los Angeles area, chose to visit a church across the river from Nanjing, a poor church composed of farmers and local residents. The 900 of them who were present at the service wanted to hear a word from their sister from the United States. So Mrs. Chun brought greeting from her church in Los Angeles. He told how the Lord has added many to their churches, and many of them were from China. And then, after the word of blessing for the church, she took her seat. At the close of the worship time, and this old lady was called back to the front to the elder. The pastor said her word had thrilled their members' hearts. They wanted her to have that morning's whole offering to help with the new building in Los Angeles that the lady was mentioning. It was about 140 US dollars, full of small bills and coins. When their overflowing grace welled up in generosity, they gave beyond their ability, and they gave in the manner of a kings and queens. Paul says to the Corinthians, I'm not commanding you, but I want to test the sincerity of your love by comparing it with the earnestness of others. That is a challenge, a sincere challenge, not only to the church of Corinthians, but also to us. Nowadays, the church is empty. Nobody is sitting in the pew. We are all back home, attending service, and do our ministries. But please don't forget, the church is still running. The church is still carrying a lot of ministries, especially St. Peter's. At this moment, we're even thinking about the redevelopment of our church. So we need financial support. Not only us, but the Synod, the national church, and all the wider Christian communities. They need support from all of us. Generous giving is from grace. Generous giving is showing grace. Generous giving is our call as Christians, the followers of Christ. Amen.